Capital punishment in Idaho goes back to territorial days. The first execution came in 1878 when a man named Tom Biago, a member of the Bannock tribe convicted of murder, was hung at the old Idaho pen. It's a place where 10 men were put to death for their crimes. Today, the Gem State is one of 27 states where capital punishment is still a thing. In fact, last year, because of a difficulty in getting medications necessary for lethal injections, Idaho brought back the firing squad to fulfill such sentences. It's doubtful that approach will be used anytime soon, since only one person has been sentenced to death in Idaho since 2011. It's because the time spent on death row usually lasts decades. Idaho has 8 people on death row right now, 7 men, 1 woman. And on average, those inmates spend 27 years on death row trying to get off it. Thomas Creech, convicted of murder back in 1976 and again in 1982 for killing a fellow inmate. All told, he has spent 47 years on and off Idaho's death row, which seems like a lot of work and a lot of time for a little outcome as far as the state is concerned. So who decides to make a murder case, for example, a death penalty case? Well, that's usually up to the prosecutors, who, should they decide that's the way they want to go, well, the clock starts with the weeks it could take to find a jury.
It would typically start with a jury questionnaire that is fairly lengthy, that identifies a number of these issues, including their attitudes about the death penalty. When we're selecting a jury for a capital case, if somebody indicates that they would be unwilling to impose the death penalty, that they're morally opposed to it and couldn't do it, that person wouldn't be qualified to serve on the jury.
Prosecutors also must know they can prove aggravating factors or circumstances, which are a much higher burden.
And so that's an additional burden of proof.
Those circumstances make the crime more heinous or severe. In Idaho, some of those include whether or not the murder manifested exceptional depravity, if it was exceptionally cruel, or if the defendant exhibited utter disregard for human life or acted with mayhem.
Then they go to a penalty where the sentencing is actually done by a jury. And in Idaho, you have to have a unanimous jury return a death sentence, right? And so it only takes one person to decide to spare the defendant's life.
Okay, so KTVB investigative reporter Alex Duggan spent weeks working on this story about the death penalty here in Idaho and how this process isn't really so easy. So I guess the first question is, you're going to see that story tonight at 10, but what factors play into how long and difficult this road is to, well, I guess, completing a death penalty?
Well, Brian, prosecutors have to prepare for a death case, and so does the defense. The defense has to prepare for a death defense, which takes a significant amount of time. And Wendy Olson said it best in one of the Cobra hearings that they're fighting for his life. Yeah. And so it's really a life or death scenario in this situation. And to basically file for a death penalty case, you have to know that those aggravating circumstances are something that you can prove. Right. It has to be more heinous. It has to be more atrocious. It has to be reckless. They have to, have caused mayhem. It has to be so severe that prosecutors know that a jury would be able to decide on that.
So it has to be, they fine-tune this and they say it has to specifically fit this criteria.
Yeah, and then the jury would decide. The jury only has to decide on one of those aggravating circumstances that would be in existence, and then they can move into the next phase, which is the death sentence phase. Okay, so 27 years on average that a person will spend on death row in Idaho. That's a long time. And you're saying because, well, there's a lot of appeals that go into this too, right? Once you get sentenced to death, then there's a whole appeal process that goes along with that. Right, exactly. The appeal process can take years, and that's because we just have a lack of, federal judges. There's just so much time that they have to go back and review from start to finish these cases, and that can just take so much time. Okay, so you mentioned one of the reasons that this takes so long is because it has to do with who actually is hearing these appeals.
We just don't have enough federal judges, and our federal judges are already overworked with all of their other stuff.
If someone has exhausted all their appeals, they can appeal the U.S. Supreme Court as a last resort. Anderson has dealt with death penalty cases in Idaho for 26 years. He has so many stacks of paper on each death penalty case, he had to move them to a separate office.
I have banker's boxes, literally banker's boxes, of files that start from the time that someone's indicted or charged with a capital crime all the way through the federal court system that take up anywhere from upwards of 30, 40 boxes. Wow. It's a lot of paper.
So that's a lot we're going to learn tonight. What else are we going to learn tonight?
Mostly just about the appeal process, more details, kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of things, and especially how that kind of plays out with what we're seeing in the Kohberger case in the Moscow killings, and what that looks like and what prosecutors could be doing right now.
Because they're still considering that with him, correct?
It has not been filed, so it's a possibility.
Okay.
Because that's the penalty for first-degree murder in Idaho, is the death penalty or life in prison.
Awesome. All right, thank you very much, Alex. You know, there's always been this question of which costs more, too, sentencing someone to death or life in prison. Back in 2014, Idaho's Office of Performance Evaluations, which is an independent group of analysts who are charged with improving the effectiveness of state government. Well, back then, 9 years ago, they were asked by then-Senators Elliott Work and Cliff Bayer to evaluate Idaho's death penalty system, calling it fragmented and inefficient. They wanted a better understanding of how it works and what it costs ultimately and how it compares to other states. The goal was to hopefully save the state millions of dollars to eliminate unnecessary wasteful spending. But the OPE could not put a dollar amount on it because they found most of Idaho's state and county agencies, the criminal justice stakeholders involved, they didn't do a very good job of tracking how they spent their time in such pursuits. They did conclude, because capital cases take longer to complete than non-capital cases, it does cost more to see a death sentence through to the end. Even just the trial portion, they usually take 7 months longer than non-capital cases. And there has not been another request to look into the death penalty system in Idaho since 2014. You can watch the entire first part of Alex's story on the death penalty for Kohberger tonight on the news at 10. Part 2 coming up tomorrow night.